Welcome, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming. My name is Olivia, and I'm a bookseller at Belmont Books. For those of you who don't know, Belmont Books is an independently owned bookstore in Belmont, Massachusetts, and we've been bringing books to the community since 2016. Before we begin, I'd like to let you know that we have a number of virtual events coming up. Tomorrow, March 24th, we are joined by Matteo Escapor in conversation with Chaya Bhuvaneswar to discuss Matteo's new book, Black Buck. And on Wednesday, March 31st, we are joined by Michelle Duster, great-granddaughter of the legendary Ida B. Wells, in conversation with Boston Globe's Renee Graham to discuss Michelle's new book, Ida B. the Queen. You can register for these and our other events on the website, same place you register for this one, belmontbooks.com. And that's also where you can purchase tonight's book, The Long Tale of Trauma. We want this to be as much like a book event as possible, so please feel free to talk in the chat. Just make sure that you are addressing it to panelists and attendees. That way you can all get to know each other in the chat. And with that, I'm very excited to introduce Elizabeth Wilcox and Sarah Hall. Elizabeth has worked as a journalist in England, Hong Kong, and the US. She has extensive experience both nationally and internationally as a newspaper columnist, radio presenter, CNBC television news producer, and web producer. Her first book, The Mom Economy, was called one of the best career books of 2003 and was syndicated columnist Joyce Lane Kennedy it was called The Best Career Book by syndicated columnist Joyce Lane Kennedy. Wilcox currently specializes in content development and strategy for educational organizations that promote social and emotional learning in early childhood and trauma-informed practices for youth. Sarah Hall is a lifelong bookworm and logophile. Sarah earned her master's degree from the USC Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism and went to work for E! Entertainment, chronicling the lives of celebrities on and off the red carpet. Since leaving Hollywood and returning to her East Coast roots, she's worked with clients and companies including Walden Media, Arnold Worldwide, Truth Initiative, and Keystone Strategy on their content and communication strategy needs. She is the content and marketing director at AuthorPods, a new digital platform that connects authors with readers, fueling intimate conversations around books. And with that, thank you all so much for coming. I'll turn it over to our readers.
Great. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Olivia.
So we're both very excited to be here. And before we kind of get into our conversation, we are thinking that I might begin by reading a little bit from The Long Tale of Trauma, just a short passage. My book is about really mothers and daughters and how trauma impacts a sort of line of mothers and the impact of that on their daughter as well. And so I thought I'd open with a little passage which takes place in 1910 with Anna. And Anna has given birth to her daughter Violet. She gave birth to her in 1904, and then her daughter ended up, it was an illegitimate birth, and her daughter ended up spending the next 6 years with her spinster aunts and lived a sort of upper middle class lifestyle. And then Anna, who was a German house servant and was impregnated by her employer's son, and they were English, decides that she wants to take back her daughter Violet at age 6. And so she brings Violet back into her home in East End London, which is very poor. And so Violet, who had lived this life of relative affluence, suddenly finds herself age 6 with a mother that she doesn't know, who's German, and she considers herself English, and a stepfather who is German Jewish, and she's living in East End London, which is quite poor. So I'm just going to read a little passage there to begin. Anna, Bethnal Green, London. Violet's acceptance of her new life took longer than Anna had hoped. That first year, there were so many times when Violet would have an outburst over the most innocuous of things. A lost sock, too many nuts on her cake. Violet's little face would flush and she would scream or run from her mother as if in need of an escape. At such times, Louis would shrug, knowing better than to get involved. Let her be, he would say when Violet was particularly uncontrolled. And in time, Violet would return, composed as if nothing had transpired between them, the past forgotten again. Give her time, Lewis would say. For as composed as Violet often was, both Anna and Lewis could see that Violet's forbearance was a thin armor to the struggle within her. So Anna waited, always reminding herself that her daughter no doubt missed her home in Rickmansworth, her pampered life, the attention and sense of belonging she once got. She reminded herself that her daughter's attitude was to be expected, and that, in fact, given her change in circumstances, she was surprisingly restrained. Violet never commented on that single worn couch or the stench in the narrow stairwell that connected all 6 flats, or the brazen woman above who entertained loud men in her flat at all hours of the night. Yes, she did carry in her a persistent and silent refutation evident in almost all that she did, in the unexpected check of her small head in response to what Anna had thought was a benign remark, or in the stiff way she carried herself through the dirty streets to her overcrowded school. Admittedly, Anna sometimes found her daughter's aloofness difficult to bear, but she accepted what she saw for what she decided it had to be, a means for her daughter to cope. She tried not to feel hurt. She kept no record of the wrongs. Maternal love, she knew, was a love so different from all else, so vast and infinite, with no start and no end. It was a love that since her daughter's birth, she had carried in every cell of her body, and having Violet home in the flesh was a visible rematerialization of what she had so long held, eternal in space, divine in the true sense, patient and kind, protected and trusted, hoped and persevered, forgiving, just like they said.
Thank you. That is really powerful and really kind of speaks to those of us who are mothers and maybe have daughters. Would you just give us a little context for those who maybe haven't read the book as to who Anna and Violet are to you?
So thank you, Sarah. I often I get so caught up in the story that I don't always clarify and contextualize. So Anna is my great-grandmother, and Violet is my daughter. I mean, sorry, not my daughter, her daughter, my grandmother. And my book sort of tracks this maternal line from Anna all the way down to me, and shares the different voices of these women at different stages of their life.
And it's sort of a really unique structure that you chose for your book. And just wondering, can you speak to why you chose to structure it as you did?
Yeah, so I've got a dual narrative. The first is this sort of historical narrative that begins in 1904 with the birth of Violet to her German mother and biological father, who is quickly dispatched off to Canada. And then it follows that sort of historic narrative through Violet growing up, and then through my mother, and then kind of ends with me and my mother. So that's the historic narrative. And what's sort of telling in that is both my grandmother Violet endured quite complex trauma as a child. She was separated from her mother and endured 2 world wars. And then my mother herself also was separated from her mother and endured the Second World War. So there is this sort of repeated early childhood trauma. And in that story, what I really wanted to explore was the impact of war on women and children. And I really thought it was important to tell that story and what toll that leaves on women and children, and really to move the story away from the battlefield where we see sort of men with severed limbs. I really wanted to tell the story of women and what they carried as a result of this sort of trauma. And so the other narrative that I've got is my own exploration of this story. And a lot of that is conversations with my mother. So since I was in my 20s, my mother has shared this story with us. And And as she got older, the trauma that she endured as a young child really started to have visible effects on her. And so I wanted to sort of show and discuss and explore the impact of that history on her, and to some extent my own evolution as a daughter, trying to understand and be empathic with what my mother has had to bear. So that's the long answer to the structure of my book, which is a dual narrative.
Was there, as you sort of began your research and these conversations, was there sort of a defining point where you knew you had to write this book and you had sort of the how and why? Did it all, I mean, was it a long process, or was there just sort of a point where it all came clear how and why it needed to be told?
So it's interesting. So this story began when I was in my 20s. That's when I began researching it. And at that point, I really thought of it as a historic sort of maternal narrative. And was really a collection of short stories that were standalone. And I thought at the time, being a sort of budding journalist and writer, that it would make a nice little historic kind of novel type piece. But what I found as over the next 20 years really was at a sort of parallel development whereby my mother started faced financial stress, really significant financial stress, and she started developing these symptoms, these sort of nondescript illness symptoms, and other challenges. Like she lost her voice, she started shaking, and she got very depressed. But at the time, no one could really diagnose what was happening to her. And then finally, she went down to the NIH, and they said, "You have PTSD, and it's a result of your experiences as a young child in the war." And my mother participated in something known as Operation Pied Piper in London, where they basically took all these small children and they put them on trains and said, "You're not going to be safe in London. We need to get you out of London." And her mother at the time they had been living in Holland. So her mother was interned in Holland, and she was in London with her father and her little brother. And she was only 3 years old. So aged 3 years old, and her brother was 1.5, they were put onto these trains up into Northern England and Wales, and these children. And they went out onto these trains, and they got off the trains, and they stood on these platforms with numbers around their neck. And they were just randomly picked up by families because the English British government thought they'd be safer. And there were some unpleasant situations that these children ended up in, to say the least. And my mother was basically then separated from her family for many years, and suffered abuse, and it was very difficult for her. And they've since done a study of those children, and so these women in later age, and they've found that almost half of those women suffer depression in level 2 depression or greater in later life. And so my mother wasn't unique to have suffered like that. And so basically what I started, to get back to your question, what I really started to determine as I kind of got older was that this story wasn't just about my mother and what she'd experienced, and my grandmother and what she'd experienced, but it was about what toll those experiences took on them. And more specifically, looking at the impact of early childhood separation and adverse childhood experiences, the impact of that in later life. And about 5 years ago, I started working for 2 organizations, both of which have social and emotional programs that they've developed. One of which is for a organization called the Lionheart Foundation, and they provide social and emotional programming to at-risk youth and incarcerated populations. And so they're really exploring and remediating and helping people who have have had difficult childhoods, they're helping them develop some of these competencies that they didn't have when they were younger. And likewise, I was working for another organization which trains teachers in early childhood. So I began to see, as I was looking through this narrative, what kind of impact early childhood trauma has, particularly separation from your mother or your father or from parents. And then on top of that, so as I was beginning to piece all this together in the last 5 years, under the then administration, which was the Trump administration, they were separating children from their parents and along the border, the migrant children. And my mother was really apoplectic about this. She sort of looked at it and said, if you separate these children from their parents, they're going to be carrying this for the rest of their lives. And she was so upset about it. And likewise, I was as well. And at that point, I thought, I've got to write this story. I've got to get it done. And I sat down and I wrote it.
Wow. Well, I mean, there's no doubt, without getting into all the extraordinary things that your mother, grandmother, great grandmother, all the just sort of incredible traumas and such that they suffered, that we won't go into without, don't want to reveal too much of the plot. But as you researched your family history over these 30 years of diligent research, did you come across anything that particularly just surprised you?
Yeah, it was interesting. So I think I came across quite a lot that surprised me, and quite a lot that surprised my mother as well. So just step back for a moment. My uncle Neville, my mother's brother, he's in the book as well, but he was doing a lot of research around his mother and his maternal line as well. And my mother was often sharing with me stories and writing up stories of her past and her mother's past and what she knew. My mother, until she was, her whole life, her mother never shared anything of her past with her. And they actually didn't discover that their mother, my uncle and my mother didn't discover that Violet was illegitimate until after she had died. They were going through her drawers and they discovered a letter that she had written her biological father saying that she'd like to meet him. And he had written back. The letter itself, of course, they didn't see, but they saw the father's response back, which was, no, it's not a good time to meet you. And my Uncle Neville was, in the meantime, sort of piecing together bits of information and providing them to my mother, providing them to me. And in the course of this discovery period, it wasn't just, he knew that she was illegitimate, and then we had to work backwards from there. So we discovered many other things, one of which was that my grandmother, lived in this kind of abject poverty after she'd lived in the sort of upper middle class lifestyle with the spinster aunts until she was 6. So my grandmother had always told my mother that she had a happy childhood, and just omitted all of these other experiences. And then on top of that, I discovered other things. For example, so my biological great grandfather, so that would have been Violet's biological father, he ended up actually committing suicide 6 months after he got the letter from his daughter Violet. It was in the 1930s in Canada, so it could have been a result of depression. Who knows why that happened? But there were pieces like that which were just quite surprising. So there were quite a few things which surprised both myself and my mother, actually.
And when doing your research, a lot of it was through family documents and letters. What other sort of sources did you turn to gather information?
So I did a lot of kind of genealogical tracking. And then also, so I had the address, for example, of where my grandmother moved to when she was 6, when her mother grabbed her, that little passage that I just read. So I looked up that location, and then I learned about that area. And as I mentioned, Lewis was German Jewish, and that was 1910, and it was the outbreak. It was pretty close to the outbreak of the First World War. And interestingly, that whole chapter was a sort of short story in itself. And I submitted it to periodical, and the editor wrote me back, and he liked the story, but he said he had one problem with it, was that he thought it was the beginning of World War II. And it wasn't till he got part way through the story that he realized it was right before World War I. And for me, that was sort of intentional in some respect, because what I think we forget is that anti-Semitism, this sort of anti-immigration, a lot of these sentiments that were sort of defined as being the build up to World War II, actually was existing before World War I. And again, we've seen a lot of that more recently. And this idea that a lot of these tendencies that people carry in them, it bubbles up at different times in history. It's not unique to one certain time. And there are implications to that. And so I wanted to explore that as well.
That's diligent research for sure. And I mean, it's just so interesting to learn how much you could find out and go back so many generations. I mean, it is, it's a really immensely personal book that you've written. And, knowing that you've made the choice to write, about your maternal relatives. And so I couldn't help but wonder, how did and does your mother feel about her, the details of her life being shared with a wider audience?
Yeah, the story didn't end the way it began, in terms of the way that my intentions when I began to write it versus the way it came out. And it's a very revealing book, because I'm talking about PTSD. I'm talking about the impact of trauma on our mental health in a very explicit and felt way. And so for my mother, being the main character in this work, that takes a lot of courage and bravery. And my mother is an incredibly brave person. I mean, you think of what she endured as a very young child. And I think she applied a lot of that courage and bravery to this book and the publication of this book, because she's often not depicted well in terms of the struggle. But what I really wanted to show was, my mother is not the effects of the trauma. She is her, that's just a mask. Her core self is this woman who has raised 7 children really well, and provided us all a loving, secure home, and with unconditional love and support, despite having had absolutely no child herself. I mean, literally from the age of 3.5, she was in foster homes. She was looking after a 1.5-year-old brother. By the time her mother was repatriated back from Holland, where she was interned, my mother had no relationship with her. She stayed in boarding schools and English Army boarding schools. And despite that, my mother was able to parent courageously and with a lot of love and support. And that is really a testament to her, I think. And I think she was able to take the good with the bad, say, you know what, this story is the story I want told. I want people to see the impact of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and what they do. And I want to start a conversation about PTSD and what it looks like, not just have this little acronym out there that we can kind of dismiss, but let's talk about what it does and how it feels.
That is immensely brave and admirable. In the book, you don't always depict yourself as the most patient or sympathetic with your mother, particularly when you are writing at the 20-something version of yourself. Would you say that writing The Long Tail of Trauma changed or evolved your relationship with your mother? And if so,
yeah,
how?
So I think this is memoir. So it's important to remember that this is sort of a subjective story, right? So this is my perception. And I see a question here, something I saw a question about creating characters. So what I try to do is my book is told through the different voices of the women who precede me, and I'm trying to communicate what it may have felt like to be in that situation. I don't know, but based on myself as a mother and how I feel about my children, I'm hoping that I can give a voice to these women who had no voice. And as I'm sort of relating to my mother, I think it's, and revealing some of the challenges that my mother faced, I think it's only fair that I show a side of me and the struggles that I have sometimes with loving and caring for somebody who carries trauma and its effects. And so I wanted, in a way, to kind of normalize not just the sort of, the good things about being a daughter and the good things about being a mother, but the struggles that we carry and what they feel like. And I hope, and I think, because since I've written this book, I've had a lot of people write to me and say, thank you. I actually feel a little better now, because these things that I've been feeling with respect to, relating with my mother or my father who endured war, or whatever trauma that they withstood. And I haven't always been my best self. I wanted to show myself not as always my best self in this book. And also I wanted to really try to create what I'm really trying to foster in myself is more empathy, to help to say, we have to look past these other effects of trauma to who this person is and be compassionate. And it's not always easy. And I wanted to show that struggle.
Yeah, no, to that end, I mean, it's a very honest depiction of motherhood in many ways. And it sort of brings me to my next question, which relates to, I think that most parents can agree, unless they're big liars, that parenting is hard work and, a challenge. And sometimes it's not the most rewarding gig going. But in today's society, motherhood is often portrayed on social media and elsewhere as this sort of idyllic, joyful, flawless state of being. And I wonder how you feel about that sort of depiction, the sort of mother as, I don't even know, influencer, maybe goddess.
Yeah, I think that's true. None of which I'm so far from. So what I really wanted to show, I felt like if I'm going to turn the lens on my mother, I better turn the lens on myself. If I'm going to turn the lens of my mother as mother, I better turn the lens of myself as mother and with children. And parenting is hard. I have, this dual narrative that I spoke of. I begin at really early on in the book talking about giving birth to my first child. And I remember the nurse coming in and saying, it was something really small, but maybe it was diapering or something. And she said, you could make a mistake there, or you're going to make a mistake. In fact, this is going to be the first of many mistakes. And I remember thinking at the time, I'm not going to make many mistakes. I'm going to be great at this. And then in fact, it's just, I feel like parenting is just this one long succession of mistakes. It's so joyful and so wonderful in so many ways, but it's super hard. And I look at my mother and how she was able to parent all of us so well with absolutely no model to work with. And I had to then say, I think it lent me, having my own children lent me more compassion and empathy and respect and just to look at what my mother achieved, given how difficult it is. And I had a roadmap. I had a father who was incredibly loving and emotionally competent, and a mother who gave her unconditional support and advocated for us tirelessly. And then here I have this mother who had really none of that. So yeah, I think I wanted to lift the veil over what motherhood and parenting is.
Yeah, at the point you just mentioned when you're talking about sort of your experience with your firstborn in the hospital and the nurse warning you about, all the things that could go wrong, you reference having the privilege to make parenting mistakes. And that really spoke to me because it sort of reframed how I thought. I mean, I too sort of think of my parenting as one long series of mistakes, but I hadn't really ever thought of it as having the privilege to make those mistakes. And do you think, or how did you think researching your maternal interest, hold on, let me reframe that. How did researching your maternal history influence your own parenting style?
Um, that's an interesting question. Maybe what I'm trying to learn to be is a little more forgiving of myself, maybe, and also I'm very frank in my book that I'm a worrier. I'm a person who's a worrier. I think a lot of us parents are, and I sometimes will perseverate for ages, and and I think in a way to look at who my mother was able to become, frankly, who my grandmother was able to become, despite um, what they endured. And so as a mother, yeah, I'm going to screw up all the time. And now my children are really adults now. But they will be okay. And then another thing that I think I learned is through, so I mentioned a lot in here, a woman that her name is Dr. Beth Gasarjian, and she worked at this nonprofit organization, or she works there, that I'd done some work for with respect to developing content for them for their online learning platform. And they're that organization that works with at-risk youth and incarcerated populations. And something that she said to me early on was, what is harmed through relationship can be healed through relationship. And end of the day, it's all about relationship. So we can use relationship and the strength of our relationships to help others to heal. And so it's not, these things that happen to us don't have to be fixed. We can, and things that happen to our children, we can, through relationship, we can help repair. Relationship is reparative and can be reparative. So it's not all bleak. Despite these mistakes that we make, we can heal and we can help others to heal.
There's hope. It's good. Going back to the adverse childhood effects that your mother, grandmother, and great grandmother all suffered through, can you say a little bit about the concept of inherited trauma? It wasn't really something I knew had a genetic tie.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I mean, so there is a study done on these rats. So you look at female rats, and they were put through trauma, as we do to poor rats. And they developed these behaviors, and they found in their female pups that they showed those same behaviors, even though they hadn't been through that trauma. And so what happens is trauma can actually turn on your gene so it expresses a certain way. And then that expression of that gene can become passed down to the next generation, sometimes through two generations. So for example, the mother might become a hoarder because you're taking food from her. The female pup may then have those same hoarding tendencies, even though they never experienced that trauma. And so it's a turning on of the gene, and it's this kind of play between genetic influence and environment. Epigenetics is another word for it. So the influence of environment on the expression of our genes.
It's really fascinating. In these current pandemic times that we're all living through, do you think that talking about mental health takes on even added importance as we consider sort of what after effects of
Yeah. I
these
think
dark days will look like?
no, I think we have to really think about a lot of, it's not just the pandemic, it's, Black Lives Matter. It's this sort of this trauma that a lot of people have, collectively or individually experienced, and really try to develop our own empathy and understanding, and understand that it's not just necessarily one generation of trauma. It's multiple generations. And 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 part of my book, part of the what I'm really trying to do, which is why I have these chapters in different voices, is really trying to, as I mentioned before, give voice to what these people have experienced, and speak to what is felt. And that's empathy. And I think that coming out of this situation, whether it's, empathy for those kids on the beach in Florida, last week, who've been given a curfew because they're just, they can't take it anymore, or whether it's people, people in New York City who have just endured, early on in early on in the pandemic, so much trauma layered onto trauma, and really trying to be compassionate, empathic, and also realize the importance of relationship in helping us heal.
Yeah, I agree. It's so important. And you never know really what someone else is going through. Kindness, the golden rule, I suppose. Obviously this book was a labor of love that involved some very real labor, given all the time you put into it, all the research, the writing, the interviewing, the imagining. What was the hardest part of your process as an author?
I guess, the hardest part for me has probably been the publication, in a way, because really not for the impact on me, but really making sure that the impact on my mother is bearable for her, because it is so exposing. And my mother's been amazing, actually. But just worrying about that, and making sure that she's okay. And she is. But that's been, it takes a deep breath. But yeah. So, and I see a couple questions here on the side that I think I might try to, sneak in. Do you mind if I do, Sarah?
I hope you do. Please do.
So I've seen one here from Chris Doyle, who's actually a friend of mine. Thank you for attending, Chris, and for asking a question too. But have you developed a view of ideas on how people can recover from childhood trauma in today's world? And I think the answer to that is something which I've been speaking to, which is really the power of relationship. I've seen, through these two organizations, particularly through Lionheart Foundation, the ways that these children in early childhood who have not had the person to whom they can attach, who help them develop emotional competence or the ability to self-regulate. Because in early childhood, we attach to somebody who is a mother or a father or an adult. And through that, we learn a lot. We learn to develop not only empathy and emotional competence, but also the ability to regulate through co-regulation. So then we learn how to self-regulate. And if we miss that, it doesn't mean that window's shut. So if that person is able to forge a strong relationship later in life, they can go a long way to healing and to developing those competencies. I mean, that's something that my Dr. Kasarjian always says to me, is that my mother was able to develop a lot of these competencies and the ability to regulate in certain ways. And so she must have got that from a relationship somewhere. And then I see a question here from Jeremy Silverfine. Have other people come forward and shared their past, which they might not have opened up about before because of your story? And the answer to that is like a resounding yes. I mean, some of these outreach I have got is just makes me basically want to break down in tears. In terms of what some of these people have endured, and even some people I know, some people I don't know. I mean, here's one story: is a woman who I know. Okay, I never knew the story before about her, but she's from Australia. Her mother was one of these children from World War II who was sent away from England, and she read my book, and she said, uh, she now understood. Her mother was in Australia and she's in the United States, her mother a lot more, but she also felt like all these emotions that she had, that someone else shared them in terms of relating with her mother. And she told me that she was actually flying back over Christmas and quarantining for 2 weeks so that she could see her mother and connect with her, having read my book. Another person who read my book contacted me afterwards and said, thank you. Her mother had been abusive towards her growing up, and now she understood the weight of what she carried much more. Another man wrote me, and he's age 74, and he said now he understands a lot more about the implications of the fact that he was separated from his mother age 7 and how that could have affected him. And those are just 3 of the stories. I have countless stories of people, and I think that came to some extent with the fact that I shared the good, the bad, and the ugly, namely a lot of the bad and ugly too. And so it was, as I mentioned before, hopefully a little normalizing for people. And then I've got another one. As a mother who has suffered tremendous PTSD, what is the best way to support young sons who also suffer from PTSD so they can move forward with their lives so well deserved? And then she goes on to talk about what had happened to their father. She wrote it here, so I'll share it. Their father was an honorable man, and my husband was falsely accused, and the narrative was never corrected. So I'm not a therapist and I'm not a psychologist, but I would, I've talked to a lot of psychologists and therapists in the process of writing this book. And I would really encourage that person to have her sons talk to somebody, and herself, because there are actually ways to help cope with PTSD, and proven therapies that work. And I think that, so some of them my mother has not explored at her age, because one thing she could do is kind of relive her experience, and she's now age 83. She really doesn't want to do that, which I respect. I wouldn't want to. I mean, it can be tough, but I would imagine. But I think that I would encourage you to get professional help for your kids. And then this is a nice one. I see beautiful pottery and objects behind you. Is there an object, photo, or physical item from the past that is a source of comfort to your mother? Actually, usually I have a picture of my mother back here. I don't know where that one went. A lot of these are just kind of artifacts and items. So I lived in England right after I graduated, and then I moved to Hong Kong, and a lot of these are back from those days. And I had an earlier question from a few ones here too that how did you navigate finding a balance between being an author, creating characters, and also holding the knowledge that you're writing about your direct relatives? So that's from Shay. Thank you for the question, Shay. I think that's a really great question, because it's a really hard, it's a really hard thing to do. And as I mentioned, the one who gets thrown under the bus is probably myself and my mother, and we can survive that and get through that. I didn't actually mention any of my siblings by name. I kind of kept them out of the story because this is a memoir. It's about my perspective, not their perspective. And so I didn't share them. In terms of of my ancestors, they're all basically dead. My Uncle Neville is still alive, and that was his direct writing that I shared, and it says that it was his direct writing. So I really tried to protect those people around me, except for I didn't protect my mother particularly, but she kind of knew the story was coming, and she wanted it told. And my mother's been awesome and brave. Um, and then here's one. Does your mother feel that your book is her trauma narrative? Um, I think it's really my narrative, not her narrative, because there are points at which I share her writing, and she sort of shares aspects of what happened to her. But I think she hasn't gone deep into what happened to her, and it's not my place to share that for her. And I don't think it's necessary, because we're really looking at the impact of the trauma which preceded us, and really and I say us in a sort of first person plural vague way, but really the trauma which preceded her, and really looking at what the effects of that are, and really looking at what I really want to do is look at the maternal narrative, and let's talk about what our mothers have endured, and what they've done, and how history has shaped them, rather than always just telling this kind of male story. I have a few more questions here that I'll just kind of go through here. Did your research and writing help you to digest and accept some of your family history and assist in moving ahead with your own life? Oh, it's Glenn Schaefer. So Glenn Schaefer was in my sixth grade class. That's awesome. Not even, yeah, seventh grade class. Gosh, hi, Glenn Schaefer. So I think it's helped me, family history. I think it's helped me, as I mentioned earlier, probably be a little more forgiving of myself. I hope it's helped me be more compassionate and understanding toward my mother. And also, I think my real takeaway is the importance of empathy, and how I need to continue to work on being empathic in order to be a better person, basically. I just think empathy is at the root of humanity. And empathy is at the root of helping people heal and helping us get through trauma. And then let me just I think I missed one more. No, I don't think I've missed anybody else on here, basically. Sorry to interject there. I just wanted to make sure I got through those questions, Sarah.
No, those were great questions. And if anyone else has a last question, I know we're sort of getting close to the end of our time together, but well, I wonder if you might want to say a word or two about your process as an author, getting your book in the hands of readers and how you go about it.
So that's a nice segue. So this book, so my first book was published with in 2003 with Berkeley, which is an imprint of Penguin, which I think is now part of Random House. So it was with a big publishing house. This book was actually published with a social sort of mission-led organization, publishing company out of Vermont called Green Writers Press. And the contrast in sort of media pickup and getting my book in the hands of people was so marked. I mean, the publishing world has shifted a little bit since then as well. But you know, I for my first book, I could get, Chicago Tribune to pick it up and someone would look at it. For this second book, Green Writers Press. I don't have a publicist. It was really, it's been difficult to get it out there. So I've had to do a lot more kind of grassroots, word of mouth, um, I don't know, promotion, I guess, which sounds like a terrible word, really, but maybe it's not a terrible word. um, and so in the process, I realized the importance of book group talks as well. And Sarah, so Sarah is actually working on a project with me now, or a new company, which is called Author Pods, where we want to help other writers out there and other authors get their books into book groups and allow authors to connect with book groups, to speak to them, and extend this kind of singular experience of reading a book to a sort of multidimensional continued experience, or more dynamic experience where you can bring the author in. What I've really found is I do get a lot of outreach from readers, and if there's a way, there's a forum whereby authors can share with the readers, and there can be some kind of interchange, I just think it's good for everybody. So Sarah's got a long background in journalism and content development. So together we've started something called Author Pods, which is something that we kind of mentioned in the sort of framing of this conversation. So watch that space. The website's about to launch, and we've got to start inviting authors to contribute, and create listings, and then hopefully readers will start to come as well, right?
That is right, authorpods.com. And we're going to be doing more talks like this where you can see us in conversation. And we're just really excited about all the potential it holds as book lovers, as a book writer, as someone who dreams of one day writing a book. We really look at it as an organic community of building conversation between readers and authors. And we're just thrilled to be getting it off the ground. So we are just in the process of our soft launch. We have lots of work to be done, but we're really just happy to be welcoming people to what we're building.
And then I think there was no, I think that about does it. Yeah, there we go. Hello, Olivia.
Hello. Those are such wonderful questions. I'm so glad I got to hear the answers to them. And as I thought that this is such a wonderful event that you get to really connect with people and about all of these really lovely things. Oh, we've got one more question. Have you considered an audiobook?
I have an audiobook. Actually, the audiobook was this fantastic experience. So I live up in Vermont, and I worked, the fellow who Vincent Freeman, he's in Randolph, Vermont, and he'd never done an audiobook before. He's a sound engineer, and he actually turns out is German, and he had moved over here about 10 years ago. And my book partially takes place during the Second World War, while Violet is right before the outbreak of the Second World War. Violet's there, and obviously talking about a lot of issues which led to the Second World War within Germany. And so it was very interesting for me to be reading this book to him, a German, never mind that my pronunciation was terrible, and so he helped me with that. But to see how he took it, because this is an American speaking about living in Germany in 1936, and then again, a few other periods of time from thereafter. And so it was this very intimate. We were in the basement during COVID, and he was in his studio, and I'm there in my little area, and I'm reading this aloud to him. And so I finished about, I don't know, probably 3 hours of reading, because there's a lot of corrections. And he comes in, and I'm quite nervous about it. And I said, "Are you okay with what I've just read?" And he said, Yes, I actually really liked it." And after that, we had this quite, it was quite, I felt quite connected to him actually. So it was amazing. Here I am in this little teeny town in Vermont, and here I'm recording my book with somebody who's German. It was quite something.
It's really remarkable when you find like threads in the world that connect you to each other and to this history and to something that, you know, in the end, most of us weren't at the time touched by, but we all carry it through our lives and and the ways that it relates to each other. I've always just found that really
Yeah.
fascinating. So it's
And we
wonderful.
have all these shared experiences. I mean, that's, all this outreach I've got from people horrible experiences that people have lived or their loved ones have lived. And there are these, as you say, these common threads. And we all have to sort of come to terms and reconcile and grapple with them. So the ability to connect and share and support one another is so important.
Well, and this is definitely a book worth supporting. So if you don't already have your copy, make sure you to get it at Belmont Books. I've added a link in the chat, but you can also find it in the confirmation email from your Zoom attendance today. So thank you all so much for coming. I know this means the world to us at Belmont Books and to our authors as well. We couldn't do it without the people and supporting and reading. And if you do want to check out her audiobook, please do. It sounds fantastic. So thank you all so much for coming. Have a great rest of your night and stay safe out there.
Thank you so much for having us, and we are very grateful. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you, Olivia and Belmont Books for hosting us. This was a great event.
All right, awesome. Have a great rest of your night, you guys.
Bye.
Thank you.